Hello and welcome back to One on One. We're talking with the 2004 Nobel Peace Laureate, Dr. Wangari Maathai of the Green Belt Movement. It's an honor to be talking with you and going through your life and learning about the things that shaped you. Now, we talked about your life in Africa and the fact you, through a little help, you got into education. Tell me about how you ended up in America and what President Kennedy had to do with this. JFK.
It's very interesting because at about that time, Kennedy was trying to become the future president of the United States. So he had some politicians around him, people like Andrew Young, people like Martin Luther King, I'm quite sure, people like Thurgood Marshall, who later helped us write our constitution in Kenya, and many others like him. And back home in Kenya, there were politicians like Tom Mboya, people like Oginga Odinga, Dr. Keano, and such people who were very keen to prepare Kenya as it was about to become independent in 1963. And now this is 1969, towards the end. And so Kennedy decides that, with these politicians, that one way to help the newly emerging African nations is to send young Africans to America to study in their colleges. And so I find myself at the right time, at the right place, and I'm uplifted with some slow-moving aircraft by comparison to what we are using today. And I go to a small college in Atchison, Kansas, Mount St. Scholastica, managed by Benedictine nuns. And that's where I spent some of the most wonderful 4 years of my life.
Interestingly enough, you arrived there as the civil rights movement was going through its kind of realization, and you noticed some interesting things, I gather.
Yeah, and you know, it's very interesting because when you live in a country like Kenya, which was actually under some form of apartheid system, you are young, you are not fully understanding what the colonial system has put in place for you and where it has put you in society. So as much as we were living under a very discriminatory system in Kenya, I get to the States and I can hardly believe what I'm seeing. And I was very inspired by people like Martin Luther King and the people around him like Jesse Jackson and Andrew Young, who were at that time in the forefront fighting for civil rights. And I was amazed to realize how oppressive the American system was. Because for many of us back in Kenya, we were really taught, perhaps by the British, knowing very well that we were very close, we were not sufficiently exposed to the life in America or to the life of slave trade. We really did not understand that whole system. And it amazes me now, in retrospect, to see how people can hide your history and can give you a complete blackout on who you are and what your people have gone through.
What you saw in America, though, I've heard you say in the past talks, you know, things like, you know, a black person going into a restaurant and having ketchup thrown at them, or...
It was amazing to see these people going in. I had a little bit a brush with it when we arrived, and as we were traveling to Kansas from New York, when we tried to have a drink in a small cafe and they wouldn't serve us. But that was nothing compared to what I was to see later. Black people going into restaurants and literally having ketchup poured on them, food poured on them, being thrown out of those cafes and restaurants, having dogs unleashed on them simply because they were trying to be Americans. And considering that this is the country of the dream, this is where everybody wants to be, I think that for me it was very surprising and amazing. But fortunately, I had a very wonderful environment. In that college, I was very well protected. I was not shielded, but I was protected in terms of actually going out and getting hurt. But it really gave me a new opening and a new understanding of human rights, so that when I go back home to Kenya, I become a very strong human rights advocate.
Now, around that time, 1969, you got married. And then in the 1980s, you got divorced. And that was a bit of a tangle because your husband said you were too strong a woman.
Well, I think that my husband, poor thing, I think that he was very much, he was a good man. But it is always very difficult sometimes when there are barriers you are breaking. The people that you are with sometimes find it very difficult to accommodate those barriers. They have pressure from their families, they have pressure from their contemporaries, and they can't understand what this woman is trying to be. So people started saying that I was a white woman in a black skin. Now that contrast, honest, was a little much. And yet all I was trying to be was a useful citizen. Now that I had acquired knowledge and skills from America, I wanted to use it. I wanted to be an effective person in my country.
But in the divorce, you started having a go at the judge and got thrown into jail.
It was amazing to me because I've always been a person who asks questions, who demands an explanation, which is partly why I was getting into trouble, because I guess as a woman, I was supposed to be seen and not heard. But especially going to America actually does give you a sense of freedom. Despite all the problems in America, you also get a sense of freedom. And by the time I come back, I am the kind of person who asks, why is that? And so I had the audacity to ask the judge, why did you say that? Or ask the lawyer who was asking me what I would have considered an unnecessary question. So instead of answering his question, I asked him my own question, and that he considered to be too arrogant. And so he turns to the judge and he says, my lord, if she can dare ask me a question, what do you think she puts my client through? And that was it. I was done.
And then they asked you to remove his name from your last name. And it was the same name, Maathai.
Yeah, which was, that is very bad because it is part of what we women go through. You marry a man, you love him, you adopt his name. And then if he decides he doesn't like you, he asks you to drop your name. Now that really is very dehumanizing because it's like you don't have an identity, that you are given identity by the man. That is probably true, but at this time and age, women want to be themselves. And traditionally, the Kikuyu women, and I'm a Kikuyu, the Kikuyu women did not change their names. They did not assume their husband's name, actually. They retained their first names. But I was persuaded to change my name to my husband's. At that time, he wanted me to be called after him. So when he told me to change my name, I was not amused. And so I decided to reclaim the name by changing it.
You had just added one extra
I added
A.
another A and I said, from now on.
Almost the same name, but different enough. Very clever. I have to ask you then, so you came back, you went through all this education in America. You obviously managed to do this east-west sort of bridge. What happened then to trigger the Greenbelt movement? What made you start to now look at the environment then?
To understand my understanding the environment, you almost have to go back to the original and to the times of the tadpoles and recognize that I'm growing up in a very green environment, a very rush environment, very rich environment. But at the same time, the British are just entrenching their systems of governance and systems of agriculture in our country. And they are cutting down forests and they are clear-cutting forests to establish monoculture plantations. And they are introducing cash crops like coffee, like tea. They're changing the way we had done agriculture in the past. Now, this is happening as I'm growing up, and then I go to America. By the time I come back, so much has changed. And the environment I knew as a child has changed a lot. So I find that women are complaining about not having firewood, which I used to pick very easily as a child. They are complaining about dirty water. Now, tadpoles, one of the reasons why I mentioned tadpoles is that it's a very good barometer of clean, quality water. And so when the water becomes dirty, polluted, there are no more tadpoles. And indeed, the stream that I knew as a child, not only was it having no more tadpoles, but it was virtually drying up. And so I understand the environmental degradation that is taking place. And that partly inspires me to begin telling my people that something very drastic was happening and that one way we could stop the further degradation was to plant trees. And I work with the women because as a woman it was easier to approach women, and I was also doing it within the auspices of the National Council of Women of Kenya.
Your individualism, your pioneering nature is what got you the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004. Now, you were the first African woman ever to be awarded that as well. Why do you think it's taken so much time to get that kind of recognition for a woman and for an African woman?
Well, actually, if you look at the the history of the Nobel Peace Prize, either of them, including the other prizes, there are very few women who have gotten Nobel Peace Prizes, and that's a reflection of the position of women in the course of our history, that so many women have not been able to get to positions of professionalism and to get involved in public issues so that they could excel on their own. But I think this is changing now, and you'll see more women being recognized, not only because there is that awareness, but also because many more women now are really putting their talents and their energy into public issues so that the committees begin to notice them.
If you'd like to be remembered a certain way, what would you like your legacy to be? How would you like people to remember you?
Well, I certainly would like people to remember me as a person who is very concerned about the environment, very concerned about what we do with the species that we cohabit this planet with, and one person who really felt that the humans ought to have a greater respect for other species than we do at the moment, because in respecting other species, in respecting other members of the human species, we are more likely to survive on this planet Earth.
Dr. Wangari Maathai, I wish you luck. God bless.
Thank you very much.